Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I have a return guest for you, Dr. Daniel Hoyer. He is Senior Research Associate and Managing Director for Seshat, Global History Databank, research scientist with the SocialAI Research Group, and founder of SODY. Last time we talked about his great book, Figuring Out the Past. I'm leaving a link to it in the description down below. And today we're talking about Cliodynamics, or the use of maths and data to study history instead of some other more traditional approaches. So, Dr. Hoyer, welcome back to the show. It's always a pleasure to everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Ricardo.
So, let's start perhaps with the most basic question here. So, what is Cliodynamics?
Cliodynamics, it is an interesting kind of new field. Really, all it means is bringing a sort of scientific method to studying the past. And so it stands for Clio, is sort of the old Greek muse of history, which is what it's named after. And dynamics is really just the study of how and why things change over time. And so it's trying to bring the kind of formalism, the theory testing, hypothesis testing from science into understanding the way that historical societies have changed over time.
And how does it compare to other more traditional approaches in history?
It's a really interesting question. I think, it's a little more in line with the traditional approaches than it seems at first. I think it can accommodate many different methods and tools. I'd say the main difference, as I say, is really trying to bring that formalism, that language of science, of quantitative reasoning. So bringing in statistics, bringing in math, bringing in sort of modeling, trying to make your assumptions explicit, trying to be formal about, okay, here's an hypothesis, here's how I'm going to test it, here's a sort of causal mechanism that we can explore. Let's see if it holds up in multiple different contexts. And again, that's kind of the scientific approach. But it fits very comfortably with, as well, the qualitative, detailed context finding of traditional history. So I think it's actually, pretty in line with some of the traditional methods, is just adding a new layer to it.
Okay, but what kinds of sources can you resort to, and what kinds of specific methodologies do you have? Because, for example, at least in some sciences, we can do experiments, but in this case, is that possible? How do you approach it?
Yeah, well, we call studying history natural experiments, and so it's not quite the same as science. You can't control all the factors. It is different. It is harder because you're not in control. You can't say, okay, I'm going to hold these three things steady and only manipulate this one thing. You just sort of get what you get. But and this is where Cliodynamics kind of comes in. If you are making your assumptions very clear, if you are, this is the benefit of the scientific method. It just puts everything on the table. You have to spell it out using math. It is very useful, and just having that kind of language of math helps to, set the stage and say, okay, well, here's what I think. Here's the connection between these variables. This is a hypothesis. Then you can actually go in the past and look for, okay, did that hold up? Did it not? Where does that pattern hold? Where are there deviations from it? And so, the more societies, the more cases, the more evidence you can gather using traditional historical means, you can then put them into this framework and use that as these sort of natural experiments to say, okay, well, yes, 85% of the cases it holds this way, but in these other 15% it doesn't, and here's why. And you can start to really unpack that. So again, it's not so much the sources, the type of evidence that you use. It's really just that approach to, I have an hypothesis, I'm going to test it. It just happens to be what you're using to test is knowledge about the past.
And so how does it relate to perhaps some more traditional approaches in history that are more based or focused on what we could call narratives? That is, this happened, that person did this, the other person did that, and this and that event happened. So how does it relate to that?
It's a really good question. It's as I say, it's more in line than it seems at first. I think the real, it's not replacing anything. Let me put it that way.
Okay.
Really what it's adding is trying to add this extra layer. So it says, okay, well, that's great. And let's keep doing that. And that's really important to have that, as you say, these narratives, these sort of stories about, well, these are the key figures. These are the actions they took. These are the reactions. And then on top of that, you're adding, okay, well, you know, why? Why did they do that? What were the pressures that were placed on them? Did other societies face similar pressures? And if so, did they respond in similar ways? If not, why not? What are the long-term effects? And so it's really kind of taking that step back and saying, okay, what's the bigger picture? What are the broad patterns, the dynamics that we're seeing? And when when you're at that level, right, when you're at the kind of macro level, when you're looking at many, dozens or even hundreds of different cases at once, it's really hard to just keep all that in your head. And this is where the sort of scientific method, the Cliodynamics tools come into play, as they help you organize and keep control of all that different evidence and material in order to really pick apart, these are the patterns, these are the causal drivers of this and that.
Mm-hmm. Does it help answer some traditional questions in history, like, for example, when people debate or have the debate between big men or big ideas, kind of approaches to history, or, for example, some more materialist approaches versus ideological approaches, stuff like that? Does it help answer those kinds of questions?
I would say so. I mean, I think it's not only does it help, it's kind of the best way to approach those. One of the things we say in the Seshat group all the time is, if you look at sort of the study of history, they are really, really good at knowing a ton about the societies that they explore. They're really, really good about coming up with ideas, basically hypotheses for why things happen. These traditional approaches are not so good at getting rid of some of the options, right? Really good at expanding and adding. They're not so good at resolving. And this is where the sort of scientific method and Cliodynamics comes in. For example, I can't even remember, somebody counted once, there were like 80 plus different hypotheses put forward, very reasonable by learned scholars, about why Rome collapsed. 80, that's a lot. It can't be all of them. And they just keep adding and adding, and okay, well, here's a new take, and what about this, and here's another factor, and that's great. So the scientific method, what it is good at is coming in and say, okay, this is fantastic. These are all different hypotheses. They make different assumptions. Let's go test them with the data. Let's go explore the history and say, okay, well, this one holds. This one is unlikely to be the case because it doesn't actually follow. And again, it just adds that structure, making things more explicit to be able to start to reduce the number of our hypotheses. And something like the big man, big ideas sort of debate is the similar thing. Like it rages for centuries, really. People go back and forth, and you can adduce evidence on all sides. Cliodynamics comes in and says, okay, well, what would it look like if it was big men, so-called, these major individuals with power, with authority, driving historical events, or if it's people are being compelled by ideas, and how do they shape? Yeah. So let's actually explore that. Let's see which ones, tend to lead to these major changes that we can explore in different societies. Yeah. We've done a little bit of that kind of work. We've looked at sort of ideological developments. It turns out, of course, as you might expect, it's a little bit of both, right? You need all of it. It's, individuals responding to ideological changes, which themselves are responding to individual actions. So you can draw this complex web. When we look at, for example, our work on the axial age, we show individuals matter, societies matter, ideas matter, material constraints matter, what else is going on in the world, environments matter, all these things matter. And the only way you can really expose all of that, and as I say, the only way you can keep all of those different forces in your mind at one time is by using this sort of quantitative formulas. And it really, really helps being able to put that together so that you can even approach a question like, is it big men or is it big ideas that drive history?
Yeah, and I guess that without an approach such as this and a more scientific approach to history, I mean, people, traditional historians, and I'm not trying to be disrespectful here in any way, but they can just come up with more and more and more different factors that they think might have played a role. Perhaps it was that person, perhaps it was that person over there, perhaps it was some of the societal, perhaps it was the societal context, because perhaps it was an invasion by another country, something like that, to explain the fall of a particular empire, for example. But without this kind of approach, at the end of the day, I guess it would just be a matter of taste or of being convinced by a certain explanation that for people to really think that would be the right answer, I guess. Right.
Yeah, exactly. And when I go to conferences, when I go to workshops of historians, you do get these debates and you get these arguments of, well, here's good evidence that it is, this charismatic leader. Here's good evidence that it is, this environmental change. And really, almost all the time, they're both right? Like these are very learned, smart people. They know what they're talking about, and they are adducing proper evidence. But it's only telling one part of the story, and if you only focus on that, as you say, you can get convinced that this is the answer, and then somebody else focuses on a different part and they're convinced that that's the answer. You need a framework to be able to say, okay, well, they actually fit together. Here's how they influence each other. This is, at one level of analysis with the individuals, environmental forces at a different level of analysis. So they actually are completely compatible explanations. But unless you have that framework to be able to see how these different forces at different levels interact, you're never going to be able to unpack it. And again, it's not like Cliodynamics wants to come in and stop, like all of that knowledge, all of the traditional historical approaches are super necessary. Yeah. Cliodynamics just wants to add a new extra layer to say, okay, well, yeah, let's take all of this great learning and let's put it into this kind of hypothesis testing type of scientific method in order to sort of move beyond some of these arguments, as you mentioned.
Mm-hmm. So let me confront you with another big question in history just before we move on to smaller questions and more circumscribed questions here. Yeah. So does history repeat itself?
That's a really good question. I mean, this is exactly the kind of thing that my colleagues and I with Seshat want to look into and start to ask these questions. And you can only even ask this question when you are looking at the grand sweep of history, when you're looking at thousands of years and hundreds of different societies. Where I land on this, I would say there's I'm misquoting Mark Twain here, but he said something along the lines of history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And I think that kind of captures it. Every society, there's always unique circumstances. No two are exactly the same. No two events are quite exactly the same. The context shifts, the environment shifts, the interaction with your neighbors is a little bit different, but there are definitely patterns. And I think that's what the rhyming really gets at. There are things that occur again and again. Humans are, we've changed, we've evolved, but there's a lot sort of at the heart of who we are as a species that has remained constant for thousands of years. How we take care of ourselves and our families, how we organize in groups, how we sort of engage in collective action, maintain material, food and shelter. All of these different drives are the same, and our solutions to problems that arise are often the same, confronting with violence, but also cooperation, supporting each other, mutual aid. All of these things you can see happen again and again and again, responding to the same kinds of circumstances that come up. So there are a lot of rhymes, but it is important to understand, A, what are the sort of unique circumstances, and B, what I think is really critical is getting at, these patterns don't just happen on their own, right? It's not just some magical thing that makes us act in certain ways. There are reasons, those reasons keep occurring, which is why these patterns happen again and again. But there are drivers, there are causal forces that lead to these outcomes. And it's really important to understand that so that we can repeat the ones we want to repeat and maybe move beyond the kind of things we don't want, like war, like violence, like all of the stereotyping that, all the bad things that we do to each other. They are recurrent, they are patterns, but they don't have to be, right? There are specific reasons why we act that way that we can move beyond. And I think having that perspective is really, really crucial, and history really helps reveal where we can be better, I would say.
And I imagine that these sort of patterns, we should expect them, or they were to be expected, because I mean, if two different societies or more than two different societies are exposed to the same circumstances, if, for example, social, economic, political factors are similar, if they are affected by, for example, natural disasters, something like that, or if people react the same way to similar sorts of circumstances, or their leaders make similar sorts of decisions, then we would expect, even though not exactly the same results, but similar results, right?
Yeah, exactly. And we do see that. The natural disasters is really good because those have been happening forever, right? As long as human societies have happened, dealing with floods, with earthquakes, with droughts. Yeah. And you can see, there's a fairly narrow range of reactions that societies have, and it depends on, their circumstances. Are they wealthy? Is their material? Is their infrastructure built up? Is there trust in sort of the state to respond? If so, you tend to see one kind of reaction where you see, a redistribution of resources. You'll see aid. You'll see rebuilding pretty quickly. In societies where the same kind of thing happens, where, inequality has taken hold, where government is kind of dysfunctional, where there's a lot of sort of corruption, the sort of response mechanisms aren't quite there. You see those kind of disasters spiral into humanitarian crises, leads to violence, leads to unrest, leads to rebellions. It's, over and over, you can spot dozens and dozens of different cases that follow one of those kind of two broad types. And it's pretty clear, what are the conditions that lead one or the other. Again, those are, in every different part of the world, every different time period, we've seen these same sort of things materialize.
So something that you've been interested in, and this is a more specific question now, is inequality, social and economic across history. So what do we know about it through Cliodynamics, and what are the effects it had on human histories, human society, throughout history?
Yeah. This is the big question. I would say we know too much about it, unfortunately. This is one of these common patterns that we see again and again of societies, even ones that for a time are experiencing growth and, looking after the well-being of the population. Yeah. It'll tend to shift. Those structures get co-opted. Wealth and sort of power holders can divert resources sort of to their own aims. Inequality then takes root. Again, we see this time and time again. I'm hard pressed to think of a society that hasn't experienced this for at least some portion of its lifespan. One of the things I've been saying lately, and this is really at the heart of my recent research, is trying to look at inequality. Why does it happen? What does it do to societies? How do we get past it? I've been calling it one of history's great villains here, and it's so corrosive in so many ways at so many levels. There's sort of the obvious, as inequality holds. Those at the sort of bottom end of the spectrum are left without. They are, don't have the resources. They are often excluded from the halls of power, from political decisions. Their material circumstances are poor, right? Their well-being declines. That's horrible, but that's kind of the obvious one. Everyone knows that. That's clear. I think what's less clear and what we've been able to reveal by Cliodynamics, again, by looking specifically at all of these different societies. Okay, what happens? What happens to different groups? How do people react? Why do these things take hold? Yeah. What we find is that inequality is just as corrosive at the other end of the spectrum, right? Even those at sort of the top, right? The wealthy elite, the politically powerful. It seems like they're doing well, and they, try to maintain these systems that divert a society's resources more and more and more into their own hands, themselves and their family. Mm-hmm. This is how inequality grows, right? You're accumulating wealth at sort of this top level, the rich 1%, the 10%, whatever you want to mark it as. but it's ephemeral, right? It's fleeting. It looks like you're being taken care of, but it actually breeds hostility. It breeds frustration. It breeds competition. You can sort of accumulate all this stuff, but you can never get everything you want. You can never translate all of that wealth into political prominence, right? People are going to be left behind. You're going to promise your children that they're going to be as well off as you are. It doesn't always happen. This leads to frustration. This leads to anger. This leads to resentment. And when that starts to bubble up, you start to see a lot of maladaptive behavior. You see partisan fighting. You see conflict. You see these sort of fundamentalist attitudes start to take hold. You start to do more and more extreme things, trying to change or recapture what you think you're owed. You can look around the world today, right? We're seeing this all over the place. Like a lot of the, political infighting, a lot of the sort of different attitudes, a lot of the sort of political dysfunction, democratic backsliding, as people are calling it. You can trace to these long periods of inequality that have been growing for decades. As people are upset because they are being left without, but people are also being upset because they have accumulated too much, and they're overproduced, right? There's too many people with too much wealth, too much power, fighting with each other, not actually getting what they want. It seems like they are, but they're not. And that's a really volatile situation to be in. And the society tends to be very fragile to that. When equality takes root and is allowed to fester for decades, it leads to violence, it leads to unrest, it in many cases leads to complete societal collapse. And I think, unfortunately, this pattern is repeating itself now. But as you say, the Cliodynamics approach, because you can track specifically, okay, here is the well-being of different groups. You can see how it changes over time. You can see it happening in different societies. We have a theoretical framework and methods to uncover when and where and why inequality like this sets in. And again, the news isn't great. History reveals that more often than not, the societies where this happens undergo some pretty catastrophic violence, major civil war, or similar. So, unfortunately, it's always depressing when I talk about this. So it's not great news, but the more we can learn about it, the more we understand the drivers. I do think there's a chance that we can, start to respond and deal with it in the present.
Mm-hmm. But do we have a good understanding of which factors drive inequality? What gives rise to inequality, basically?
A lot of things.
Okay.
It sort of, because it occurs so frequently, a lot of times what we see is there will be a shift where a society will sort of, come into being. It's putting in particular structures to grow. It's growing its wealth. It's building things. It's growing its infrastructure. It's maybe expanding its territory. It's growing its people. Its population grows. And, there's often some inequalities, but they're usually kept fairly low. Most societies, when they are functioning well, have mechanisms to keep that inequality kind of at bay. Okay. There's, taxes, there's spending, there's welfare programs. Even in ancient societies, there were programs and infrastructure that were looking to distribute the resources broadly to all of the people. So everyone was benefiting a little bit as the society is going along. What happens is usually there ends up being a mismatch in that structure. So one part of it will kind of still grow while the other parts stop. And that kind of breeds these opportunities for diverting the resources more and more to those with power, to those with wealth. And it starts really slowly. This is why it creeps in, right? It's not like it just happens overnight that everyone can see it and somebody passes a law that says, okay, all of a sudden, all of the tax revenue of the society is going to go to me and my friends. Like, it's not that dramatic. Mm-hmm. And this is, I think, why it's able to take root. It's hard to see on the ground when you're living in it. But there will be people or families with particular, have a little bit more authority, have a little bit more wealth than others. And instead of all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, but over time, the structures that were sort of keeping that at bay start to get loosened a little bit, right? You say, okay, well, everything's going well. There's sort of population growth. The economy's growing. There's a lot of people. Labor's getting a little bit cheap. I can take a little bit more, right? I'm a business owner. I'm interested in sort of buying this labor. It's getting a little bit cheap. My profits are growing. I'm going to use those profits to buy a little bit more land. I'm going to use those profits to secure my position for myself and my children a little bit further. And then they have an extra, their wealth has then grown in that generation. Then they do the same thing. So in the next generation, it grows a little more. And it takes a little bit of time, but over generations, it can become really obscene, the amount of wealth and the amount of inequality, right? So it's that kind of action, right? It's decisions by individuals, especially those with wealth and power, to give themselves a little bit more wealth and power. And when you do that a bunch of different times, you end up with fairly drastic inequality. And, you start to, people with wealth who are also, hold positions of political authority, they're kind of in charge of the rules. And if the rules are curtailing their ability to divert resources to themselves, they can change those rules. They can, lower the tax rates. They can make sure that, instead of the state spending its money on schools and hospitals, they're spending it on, buying the goods that me and my wealthy people produce, right? Whether it's, agricultural goods and oil or fancy ceramics or tiles or whatever it happens to be. And again, this is, even ancient societies go through this. And slowly you pick away, you sort of turn on that wealth pump, as my friend Peter Turchin calls it. And then all of a sudden now the resources that had been redirected back to the majority population are being redirected to just that sort of wealthy 1% elite. And that's really how it takes hold. And it takes many different forms, but it's always that kind of process.
But I mean, for a society to reach such high levels of inequality that it starts crumbling, or the societal structure, the societal cohesion starts crumbling, I mean, it has to be done intentionally, right? I mean, it's people, the economic elites, together with politicians, making those decisions. It's not something that just occurs. I'm not sure if this is the best word to use here, but but it's not something that occurs naturally, right? Because I'm asking you that because sometimes we hear suggestions from certain people, certain pundits, for example, that if inequality rises, it's just the system, it's just how the system works, it's inevitable, something like that. But I mean, at least according to what you just said there, it seems to me that it's not inevitable, for example.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say, again, this is why Cliodynamics is helpful, because it helps us, but it's true, it gives us that frame to really explore a question like that. So what we find, and if you look at, for example, evolutionary work, if you even look at other species, what we find is that there's a bit of a contradiction in the way that humans work.
Okay.
So there is, natural is maybe not the right word. There's not really a good word for it. It is very common, and there are reasons why humans and most other species are okay with hierarchies, right? Hierarchies are very dangerous, but they also can be very helpful, right? Like there's a coordination challenge, having somebody in charge, even just to set the agenda, right? If you've ever been in like a meeting with more than 3 people, it can be pretty chaotic unless there's kind of somebody in charge, somebody like you who's actually leading the interview, asking the questions, right? There is a reason why these sorts of hierarchies emerge in humans and other groups, right? So we're very comfortable with that. It is very helpful in a lot of circumstances, especially as societies become bigger in scale. It's just so hard to coordinate, to keep track, to manage hundreds, if not millions of different people without some kinds of positions of authority in some way. So there is that. That is, natural, if that's the word you want to use, and many people do, as you point out. So there is something there, right? There is something useful in that. There's a reason that emerges again and again and again in different contexts throughout history and even in other species. On the other hand, humans are naturally evolved to be pretty averse and sort of disgusted by gross inequities. So those kind of two things don't seem like they go together, but they sort of do, right? Like even if you run psychological experiments, you can sort of tell people, in the abstract, is it fair if, person X has 100 times more wealth than person Y? Pretty much everybody will say, yes, that's not fair. That shouldn't happen. Some rule should come in. Even those with extreme wealth would say, that's not right. Some rule should happen. So we are, inclined to not accept those kinds of extreme inequalities, especially when it becomes embedded in the person rather than the position, right? So there's hierarchies in terms of having a person like a president, a prime minister, whatever. But one of the reasons we have sort of term limits and these kinds of rules is to get around this contradiction. We want there to be somebody in charge, but we don't want often a person to have too much power. So we try to have these institutions that kind of balance those two things. And with wealth, again, this happens that in many cases, when things are going well, you will have hierarchies emerge. You'll have people who are, in charge of political stuff or military or economic. They gain these sort of extra amounts of power because of their position. And it works for a time. But when they sort of hold on to that, when they use that power to give themselves a little bit more, to solidify that, to pass that on to their children, so that it's not just the office itself that holds power, it's me and my family. That becomes a little bit of a different situation. That's how it can then grow generation after generation and become sort of this entrenched inequity that just builds and grows and becomes farther. So it is the result of decisions, but it's not always just purely selfish and with ill intent. People honestly think, okay, well, I'm performing a service. I'm the governor. I'm, the CEO, whatever. I deserve a little bit more. I'm doing something important. My action, provides this benefit to the society. And so, I want to look after my kids. And I'm not thinking about the impact on the wider society. If I was, maybe I wouldn't do the same thing. But if you're narrowly focused on, okay, well, I want to take care of myself and my family, so I'm going to act in this way. And it seems small, and there's no immediate effect from it. But then in the next generation, your kid does the same thing. And then their kid does the same thing. And then 100 other kids do the same thing. And before you know it, it's gone out of control. So it's not quite always as intentional. I don't think that the individuals are necessarily always the villains in this story. It is the system, right? It's the system that, you need institutions, you need rules, you need regulations that prevent that kind of action. Because if you don't have them, if those institutions are weakened, then very small, seemingly with good intent kind of actions can lead to these terrible consequences down the road. And I think that's where we are. And again, this is why one of the reasons why the historical approach is so important is, you can look at sort of the state of inequality today in any kind of snapshot, but you're never going to understand why it happened unless you look 25, 30, 50 years before, because it takes a lot of time for it to get to where it is today. Right. So you really need that long-term dynamic kind of understanding, because it's not just one big decision by a selfish jerk. It's a bunch of little decisions by pretty well-meaning individuals that lead to these bad situations. I don't know if that makes sense, but there is that kind of contradiction of, we do want and accept some kinds of hierarchy, but we also don't want too much inequality. And it's really hard to maintain a balance there. It's sort of a constant vigilance is needed.
So earlier, when I asked you the first question about inequality, you mentioned phenomena like elite overproduction and infighting. But is it that in more unequal societies, we also see more competition, not only among people who are already part of the elites and want to accumulate even more wealth and power and so on, but also across the other socioeconomic strata? I mean, is there also more competition for people to try to reach those higher spots because they are the most secure in their societies?
Yeah, that's extremely well put. I mean, I think that's exactly right. And this is, again, what we see time and time again when we explore these situations. And this is what I mean that inequality is corrosive throughout. It is, as this wealth accumulates, generally what we find, and this is common again throughout different contexts, but as people amass wealth and authority, they almost always want to translate that into other aspects. So, if you get rich, you want to also be a politician, or you also, whatever the society values, you want to have this sort of prestigious authority in this other position. Generally, those are kind of limited. Those are fixed, right? Like, you look at the US, there's 100 senators. There's always been 100 senators. That's it. So no matter how many rich people think they deserve a Senate seat, there's only ever going to be 100 at a time. And so the more rich people come in, the more wealth amasses, the more people think they have a shot or deserve one of those positions, the more there's going to be frustration because, people are going to be left out. But as you say, as that is happening, people, just below that are seeing this, if I just had a little bit more wealth, I could be like them. I could join that class. Oh, they look like they're having a lot of fun. They look like they're doing great. Yeah, I'm pretty well off, but I'm not super rich like my neighbor. I went to this party with that guy. I want to be like him. So you then strive to get that extra wealth. But a bunch of other people are doing that too. So again, that competition goes in. And as you say, at the same time, as this inequality is getting deeper, it also means that there's more and more people sort of in the bottom 80%, let's say, of the socioeconomic strata who are suffering, right? Legitimately. Their well-being is declining. They don't have material resources. They don't feel like they're being included in the political process because they're not. And they're frustrated. They're angry. And that breeds competition as well, both with, anger at the wealthy elites who are in these halls of power. You say, well, how come you have everything? I want you to change the system. I want to bring you down. I want to, change things up. But also, as you say, with each other, we do find that factions tend to form. You do see this sort of partisanship, even among the non-elite classes. Again, a lot of it is, well, maybe it's you're different than me. Maybe you're the reason why I'm suffering. There's a reason that sort of xenophobic, nationalist kind of attitudes, again, these are not modern phenomena. You see these across history. When things aren't going well, when inequality takes hold, people start to lash out. They want to look for a scapegoat. They want to see, okay, who is keeping me down? Who is an other? Who's a different group? Who's different than me that I can maybe blame for what's going on or focus my anger on? So you see those kind of splits. You see those factions forming. You want to be upwardly socially mobile, but maybe you're being prevented because the system, the structure has now developed, inequality has developed to a way that you're not there. And when you combine both of those, when there's factions and unrest among the non-elites, and there's overproduction and competition among the elites, they tend to join up. And that's when you really see violence spike. Like most major civil wars follow that path, right? It's a very, as I say, it's a very dangerous, very volatile situation. I should say, there is a line of thought that says, well, that's actually necessary, that the only way you can, once you get in the situation where the system isn't working, where you have this inequality, you need something to break it. There is some historical evidence for that. It's a little choppy, but there are, some suggestions that, okay, you need some dramatic event to change the system, like a civil war. I am always of the opinion that, we can have the change without the violence. Like civil wars are awful. They are horrible. All wars are horrible. They're like, that's what we want to avoid. And we also want to improve people's lives. We should be able to do the one without having to have the other. It's also the case that not every civil war or major dramatic, violent revolution or rebellion, it doesn't always lead to improvement in people's well-being in the next phase. Like oftentimes it leads to authoritarian crackdowns. And so there's no guarantee. It's a little bit of a be careful what you wish for. Like I get the mindset that sort of says, well, maybe this is something we need. Maybe this is something we should be pushing for. it's historically we find that it's not as straightforward as it may seem sometimes, I guess is where I'm trying to get to. That was a long answer to your question, but it's a really important topic, I think. And so,
yeah. But when we reach a point in a particular society where a revolution is about to occur, I mean, what leads to a revolution? Is it people at the bottom because by then we have a huge number of people who have been basically abandoned by the system and are incredibly frustrated? Is it them mobilizing among themselves, or is it, for example, some people who are part of the elites mobilizing them for revolution?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's actually part of a research project that I have right now ongoing with a colleague, Rachel Ainsworth. We're trying to look into revolutions specifically. Why do they happen? And especially what happens afterwards? Like, what are the conditions that a revolution will lead to improvements in people's lives, and when doesn't it? And it's really interesting. So, you definitely have movements of, that kind of grassroots style movement where you have a groundswell of popular unrest. Rarely, almost never, is that sufficient for a major system change revolution. You can have violence, you can have sort of protests, you can have unrests because of that sort of popular groundswell. Maybe sometimes you can get institutional reforms because of it. I'm actually working on a piece right now that looks at different cases. For example, we've been looking at the mid-19th century England. Again, popular groundswell of unrest. There was violence, there was protest, there was major strikes at factories. This is early industrial England. And what happened was, the elite, the political class were fairly cohesive. So it didn't lead to a civil war, it didn't spiral. But there was kind of enough politicians, enough elite who said, well, this isn't going well. This isn't going to end well for us. We should probably take some of these demands seriously. And it led to actually this period of good reforms, like safety protections for workers in factories and wage protections. And, a lot of good kind of welfare policies came from it. We wouldn't call that a revolution, right? That's a mini rebellion, that sort of protest that led to this period of reform. When you're talking about like a major armed revolution, that's so big that we historians can actually sort of identify it as a revolution. In almost every case, you get that groundswell of unrest and people sort of taking up arms to make change. But it has to link up with frustrated elites as well. Like if the people in power hold together, if they are completely united, a revolution doesn't have a chance in pretty much any situation. You need at least some factions of those with wealth and power to get on board for it to turn into a real major revolutionary moment in pretty much every case, I would say. And again, for good and bad. Sometimes that leads to, positive system change. Sometimes it's just a bunch of violence and things are kind of worse afterwards. You get a little bit of both. But in almost every sort of major revolutionary case, it is a combination of non-elites getting frustrated and elites also being sort of feeling left out by the current status quo and wanting to upend things, wanting things to change.
But is that because the elites, if they all get together, they have power over, or they can control the military, and so they are more powerful than the rest of the population? Because I was wondering, because one could think that, but the people at the bottom are so many that they can overthrow the elites anyway. But I mean, why is it that they need some support from at least a faction of the elites?
Yeah, it is that sort of suppressive mechanism. Like if those who are in most control of the wealth, the political authority, the military authority, the use of violence, if they are united and are willing to sort of use their authority to suppress dissent, they can suppress dissent in almost every case.
Okay.
I'm trying to think of examples where you can see that all the time. It's short-lived, I will say. Like you can't have a society that does that for hundreds of years and it functions super well. Eventually it will crack, right? Eventually, you're devoting so much time and effort to dissent that either, an elite group will splinter off and then you're not united anymore. Or what happens most of the time, those are weakened societies that are taken over by somebody else. Right? It's not a viable long-term strategy, but it can suppress dissent. It can suppress a potential revolution in the short term. You think of like Jack Goldstone writes a lot about this and about the way that any sort of major revolution needs to have some power holders in charge. You can find suppression, all over the place. And if the powers that be want to, they generally can, but only for a time. And so, this is what I mean is that, that's not necessarily the right path if you want things to change. It's history suggests that you want to get people on board, you want to build coalitions, you want to do some of that. It can't just be popular uprising. Okay, we're going to come with pitchforks and take your stuff. That tends not to work out so well for anybody. It's sort of my caution to the organizers out there, I guess.
Yeah. So, but do we have good examples of societies who, across history, have been able to, so to speak, right the ship before it got to a point where they could no longer do it, where extreme inequality was so high that a revolution or some sort of uprising was not preventable?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And one of the things I'm trying to focus on right now, it's harder to find than you would like it to be. There's only a sort of smattering of different examples. It is difficult to sort of assess and discover, a revolution that didn't happen. It is really tricky. I think of, for example, I was just talking about the 19th century in England. You can look at, English history in sort of the large sweep of things. You look at sort of the 17th century. You look at, inequality was on the rise. There was a lot of unrest. There was, pretty extreme suffering by large segments of the population. This is sort of late medieval, early modern period. It's sort of post-feudal kind of situation. There's a lot of extreme restrictions on many people, in terms of their wealth, in terms of their movement, in terms of their access. There was a groundswell of unrest. But that had been suppressed for hundreds of years, right? Like it was unequal, sort of medieval feudal period Europe was highly unequal. And it's not like everyone was rioting in the streets every year. This is sort of part of the example of what I mean. When sort of the elites, when the power holders were united, they could keep that at bay fairly well. 17th century in England, this starts to creep into this inequality, this different factioning that's forming, fights between different religious branches, fights between sort of the landed economic elite and some of the other sort of elites who are growing up and getting wealth from trade and other sources. It's starting to create these frictions. You can see, for a lot of reasons we don't need to get into, but it spirals into one of these major periods and it turns into civil war, right? It's a serious thing. All of these different conditions are there: inequality, unrest, elite overproduction, different sources of wealth and power coming to a head, leading to this friction. So that happens. And that's the most common thing. Again, what happens, you look at the same country a few hundred years later, inequality is again taken root for the same kind of reasons. It was reset a little bit after the Civil War, but then over time, over generations, it grew back up. Unrest is there. Industrialization is coming to the country. So people are getting really, really, really rich from this industrial movement, but also many people are suffering, right? There's just no protection. There's no wage protections. There's no safety regulations in early factories in early industrial Europe. It's horrible conditions. People are really suffering. There's a lot of people who are moving to the cities because they just can't find enough land and work in the farmlands. Mm-hmm. So they move to the cities and all they can find are these really horrible jobs in these factories. The conditions are terrible. They're way, way overworked. They're dying. Disease is rampant. It's awful. So there's a lot of unrest. There's violence. There's things that are happening. And in many cases, the elite would come in and say, well, too bad. I'm going to suppress this. I'm going to kind of keep this at bay. And for a while, they did that, right? There were strikes, there were riots in factories where workers, walked out en masse. And the military was called in and said, okay, we're putting a stop to this. We are suppressing this. So that definitely happened. But what it takes, and there's a handful of other cases where this happens. This happens in early 20th century US as well, basically the same exact process with this early industrial situation. What happens is you see the suffering, you see how much money, how much time, how much resources, how much effort are being spent just suppressing this dissent. There was enough people in Parliament in England at the time in the mid-19th century. It's not necessarily that their motives were entirely pure and pro-social. They were maybe saying, the only way I'm going to hold on to my wealth and authority is we need to take some of these things seriously. We need to say, okay, these people are upset. They have specific demands. Maybe it would be better and cheaper for us as the state to actually meet some of them. So there was a switch, right? So at first, you're sending in the military to suppress riots at these factories. Then enough politicians are saying, well, we should take this seriously. There were, the labor groups were in conversation with some of these elites, and they said, well, we are suffering. You should do something about it. You should make our lives better, and we wouldn't protest so much. And you start to pass all these different laws. You start to pass safety regulations at factories. You start to give non-property owners the vote for the first time in the mid-19th century. So there was this sort of political reform. There was wage protections. There was all this spending on, what they called at the time poorhouses, which was this attempt to provide food and shelter for those who were suffering. It didn't really work that well. Like, it wasn't a super great system, but at least it was a start. It was an attempt. It was something to build on. And it worked, right? Dissent leveled off. And without a ton of violence, you actually improved people's lives significantly. Again, it was partial. It didn't go as far as it should have, but it was at least a start. It was a non-violent way to actually improve people's well-being. And I think there are enough examples that look like that we can sort of point to and see. It requires, just as a major revolution requires unrest among the elite power holders, successful nonviolent reform often, pretty much almost always, requires some buy-in from the elite power holders to say, yes, this is better for all of us. Even if I'm giving up some of my wealth and privilege, it's better for everybody, including myself, to have a system, a society that works, that is stable, that can last in the long term. It's really changing that sort of short-term thinking of, I need to hold on to what I have right now, for longer-term thinking, saying, well, if I give up a little bit now, everyone will be better off in the long term. I think that's really at the heart of these successful reform kind of movements. Really hard to convince people in the moment to do that have that kind of long perspective. But I really think that's a lot of where these conversations today, where we're seeing, again, these same kind of patterns sprout up. This is where we want to be going and what we want to sort of hold on to.
Okay, I was actually going to ask you exactly about that. So do we see the same kinds of dynamics and patterns playing out in our contemporary societies when it comes to inequality, social unrest, elite overproduction, and phenomena like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is something, so, our new organization, SODY for SocialAI, really, this is why it exists. It's sort of an offshoot of our work with Seshat. With Seshat, we're trying to understand these patterns and understand history. SODY is kind of giving us that platform to say, okay, well, let's take what we've learned, let's take what we know about these historical processes and apply them to lessons for the present day. How can we use this to maybe help, improve people's lives today? And one of the reasons that we started this organization is this realization that we are repeating, we are filling out the same rhyme from the past. And, one of the questions we had, Peter Turchin and I, when we started a few years ago looking into crises, where we're like, okay, well, we assume that modern crises, from let's say the 20th century on, are going to look pretty different from, pre-industrial crises. That was sort of our assumption. So we started to look into it. We were exploring more contemporary societies. And more we found, oh, wait a minute. This actually looks kind of the same, even though we have all this new technology. The economy is totally different. The way we produce things, fossil fuels, industrialization, the internet, now AI, we have all these amazing technologies, right? There's a lot of things that are totally new. But as I say, humans are still humans, and we are still doing many of the same things and falling into many of the same patterns that we saw before. It was actually even surprising to us about how many similarities there are. Again, the same things that I've been talking about, you see people being able to, in many countries, especially in sort of the Western or global North world, late 1970s, early 1980s, there was this period where, the prevailing kind of economic and political wisdom was, oh, there's too many regulations, there's too much rules, we need to grow the economy at any cost. And this sort of allowed and promoted individuals with wealth and power to kind of set the rules. And again, as we were talking about a few minutes ago, what happens? It's what always happens. You get some wealth, you get some authority, you say, okay, let's change the tax code a little bit more. Let's ease up on some of these banking regulations so that we can grow the economy. And it worked. The economies have been growing, but it's also a small number of people have been capturing more and more of that wealth, right? The economic growth is going into very few people's hands. And it's over time, right? It's multiple generations, tweaking a tax rule, tweaking a banking rule, tweaking the way that the economy works, buying real estate, how insurance, like a little bit at a time, generation after generation. Now we are finding ourselves in this situation where inequality is at levels it hasn't been in hundreds of years in many countries. So it's exactly the same kind of pattern. It's surprising at how similar it is, even though so much of our world is so different. Those kind of core human traits, our human behaviors and responses are really the same. And what this means is we are now facing the same things that people have faced in the past, where we have this unrest, where we have this elite overproduction and fighting, we have this partisanship, we have this scapegoating and this sort of retreat to fundamentalist, nationalist kind of ideas. And we are seeing the violence that often happens from these situations start to arise today too, right? It is not surprising, given the situation that we are seeing what we're seeing today. But it also means that we can, the good news is that it means that we can borrow and adapt some of these things from the past that worked to ease tensions. Those still should be applicable and useful today. These kinds of reforms, improving people's livelihoods, there are ways to do this. We just need the sort of political and social will to put it into practice. But yeah, the patterns are still there. It's eerie how similar these are.
But what do you mean exactly when you say that we are living in an age of polycrisis? What are polycrises?
So this is really, it's a framework to help us understand exactly what's happening today. And this is, one of the things that is different, not entirely. There are situations in the past that are similar to this, but never before have we seen on such a global, truly global scale, so many different societies all at once experiencing the same kind of thing, right? The coordination, the synchrony between these patterns, that's kind of new. That's pretty scary. Again, there's a reason. It's because the economy is global. There's the same sorts of things are now affecting the same societies at the same time in a way that hadn't happened before, right? COVID is a global disease because we're all so interconnected. And this is really what the polycrisis idea is trying to capture. Yeah. It's that the state of our systems, our economic system, our communications technology, travel, our political system, we are so entangled with each other, right? Everything you can imagine, every kind of system, every country is really intimately connected and interacts with others. And what this means is that if one system goes into dysfunction, say there's, a recession in one country, a major recession in one country, it's going to affect the economy of other countries, right? We're all so interconnected. And if the economy of all these countries is affected, it's also going to affect the politics of many countries. It's going to affect food production. It's going to affect the environment. Everything is interconnected, right? So one thing drives another thing, which drives another thing, which impacts the first thing. It's this really complex mechanism, this feedback. I have friends at the Cascade Institute who've done a really good job of trying to articulate this. And this is, they use this term polycrisis to describe the state of the world where all of our systems are interconnected and almost all of them are under crisis right now. And again, it's these long-term stressors that build up, the way that inequality builds up over decades, the way that our environment has been suffering for decades because of our production and consumption habits. These are long-term stresses that have built up, that have put all these different systems at risk. And then you have these triggering events, right? These fast-moving trigger events that hit those structures. A flash flood, a hurricane, a blip in the economy, a recession. But because the stress is so high, when these things happen, it tends to permeate and lead to enormous damage. Whereas if those same, trigger events had happened when everything was healthy, they would have just been a little blip. It would have caused some damage, but we would have been able to recover quickly. But because we're under such high stress and all of these things are so connected, one thing goes wrong in one place, it tends to permeate throughout the globe and lead to a ton of dysfunction. And that keeps us at risk, that keeps us kind of vulnerable for the next thing to happen. And this is really what the polycrisis is. This is what we're facing. There have been polycrises in the past, at least periods that are similar to the polycrisis. So there is still a role for history to play here. But it is, there are still some unique aspects as well, just how global, how truly large scale this interconnection is. That's happening today, which means it puts an even greater premium on us to deal with some of these long-term stresses, like this deep-rooted inequality that has taken hold in so many different countries. Like it is, that is really one of the core things that is putting us so at risk, and therefore that's one of the things that can help get us out of it. Even the environmental degradation we're seeing, a lot of that is fueled by inequality, right? By this over amassing of wealth and consumption. So, as I always say, like dealing with inequality is a climate solution, right? These are not completely separate problems or phenomena. And I think this is what the polycrisis is really trying to expose, how that all works together.
Okay, so one last question then. You've already alluded to this before, but when it comes to these polycrises and perhaps focusing more on inequality itself, because that's what we've been talking about the most here today.
Yeah.
I mean, does Cliodynamics have anything to tell us, or do we have anything to learn from it about what we should do to tackle this issue? I mean, do you have any suggestions, any lessons about it that we could apply today?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a big, important question, and something I think a lot about. It's not as clear cut as, okay, well, history says we need to do A, B, and C, so we just do them, and it's a sort of one size fits all roadmap. On the other hand, I do think that Cliodynamics does have a lot to say. It does. It can help. Really, what it helps is, first of all, just exposing the depth of the problem. And again, as we talked about, a lot of people know that inequality is a big problem today. I don't think that many people, even, I've talked to some politicians and some policymakers, and it comes as a surprise to them just how deep the roots of the problem are, that it goes back decades and generations, that it is so structural that, it's not just we want to assume that it's, one policy, one rule that we can undo that led to it. When you start to expose that it's, dozens of different actions and different things over, 20 to 30 years, it just shows you that the problem is a bigger scope than you think. And history can help us expose just how deep these roots are. And that leads to different kinds of solutions and different kinds of actions that need to be taken. So you're not just, dealing with the surface problem, you're really getting at the roots. You're really getting at the true causes of the problem. And I think Cliodynamics is really helpful in exposing that. The other thing is that, as we have talked about, there are periods where inequality has grown high. There are even periods where, environmental and ecological distress, like we're experiencing today, has been very prominent. Some societies dealt with it really poorly and collapsed. Some societies dealt with it a little bit better and were able to maintain some resilience. We can learn lessons from that. We can see what people have done in the past when facing the same kind of problems we're facing today, both for good and bad. And this gives us options, right? Again, it's not a one-for-one roadmap, right? It's not like, it's not historians should be, the rulers of us all. We have some ideas. We can give you options. We can tell you what has worked, what hasn't worked in context. We can tell you what is similar and what isn't similar today. Yeah. And this should form part of the conversation, not the whole of it. But I think these ideas, this understanding needs to be part of the discussions that advocates, that NGOs, that government officials, that UN officials, policymakers are having about what to do when we see inequality. What has worked in the past? What has the context been? Can we apply some of these lessons today? And I think there are a lot that we can. We have to reshape some of the things for our modern circumstances. But I think it would be a mistake to overlook and ignore what history has to teach us, because we are and always have been humans responding to these kinds of pressures. And the way that we have done that successfully and unsuccessfully in the past can really help narrow our possibility space for where we're trying to go today and in the future. So I do think there is a major role for Cliodynamics and this kind of approach. And this is what we're trying to be part of these conversations right now.
Great. So if people are interested, where can they find you and your work on the internet?
Yeah, so I would go to seshatdatabank.info for historical work, and go to SODY.info, SODY.org, which is so-dy.org, for our more kind of policy, future-oriented type work. And please feel free to reach out to me, send me an email, and we can talk about how this all works even further.
Great. So, Dr. Hoyer, thank you so much again for this great talk. It's always a pleasure talking to you, as I said at the beginning, and this has been great. So
it's been fantastic. Thank you, Ricardo. It's really great to be able to share these thoughts and sort of get this out there. So thank you for having me back.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Muller, Hans Fredrik Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Fortiago, Nunes, Fergal Kossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Allman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Igni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.